Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 14 of my series on the myth of authority. Today, we're continuing our discussion about the transition to a free society. You know, libertarians and anarchists so clearly see the evils of statism that it can make it hard for us to recognize the positive trends, the white pills. That's why for us, white pills are sometimes even controversial. I'm guessing this series proves the point. We've uncovered some awesome white pills so far, which at first glance do seem controversial. But if you've been listening to all the episodes, you'd know they're grounded in reality. They actually make common sense. They're really not controversial. Today's episode fits right in line with that. So to prepare, let me give you a few examples of white pills that might have raised your eyebrows when you first heard them. And again, I've linked to the whole series in case you need to listen or re-listen to the supporting discussions. Here's a good one. The common people, the majority, are much closer to thinking like us than you might assume based on how fully indoctrinated into statism they are. We feel separated from them by an enormous ideological gulf. But actually, no. What I've called their true self is already with us. They do not tolerate rulers in their private lives. In that respect, they are with us. What's in the way is the fog that makes them think there's exceptions when it comes to political rulers. So really, the distance they have to travel is the single step of eliminating that exception. Here's a related white pill regarding the work that we imagine we need to do in this movement. Truth is, it's much simpler, far less daunting than we might assume, because we don't have to convince them of their right to self-rule in their private sphere. We don't have to change their mind about that moral sense. That's work that's off our plate. Our job, if any, is to help them overcome the exception they make. We can do that by acknowledging and affirming their true self, and then try to help them be consistent. Help them clear their mind of a fog that masks their true self. A white pill number that works in our favor is this: the number of people who need to overcome the myth so that a tipping point is reached is far less than we assume. That particular white pill is going to get fleshed out soon in this series. Another biggie: the transition to a free society has started. The myth of authority has begun the process of erosion. Remember, the myth's strength is the measuring stick of the strength of the state. Through most of history, the state was solid and bulletproof because the myth of authority was bulletproof. Not anymore. About 50 years ago, the foundational scholarly work in libertarian thinking started. It captured the attention of enough people in those early years to trigger a slow but steady dispersion of these ideas. Today, it's pretty easy to find them discussed openly and broadly. We're still at the very early stages of the transition, but make no mistake, it has begun. Also, I dispensed some strategic white pills. For example, the state itself is not a thinking entity. So, great news. It cannot strategize to defend itself in the transition. It doesn't even know it's happening. It's a clueless bystander. And a similar strategic white pill is just how weak the state is. Libertarian perception often regards the state as this larger-than-life behemoth. A libertarian sees themselves as one puny human, and that makes them feel overmatched. Yet, the white pill is the opposite. The state is weak. Why? For one, it's not based on reality and truth. It's the product of a false myth. Its premises are self-contradictory, unsupportable in reason and logic. And if that's not enough, the real agents of the state, whom I've labeled as the bullies, they're the ones who are outnumbered. Using United States numbers, there's only about 3 million agents of the state. The rest of us number 330 million. Another huge white pill is that we don't have to work to undo the state, to dismantle it. More work off our plate, because all that needs doing is to undo the myth itself. Reality takes care of the rest, because the house of cards falls without the belief in authority. Which segues to this episode, where I'll flesh out one of my hands-down favorite white pills, one that I teased at the end of the previous episode. I'm not shy about giving you the punchline up front, so here it is. As the transition plays out, the state itself is going to back off. They, the state bullies, will be doing the heavy lifting of the undoing of the state. No, not at this early point, but in a quite noticeable way down the line. They, the bullies, will systematically exit the stage. As you probably know, most private bullies are scared children at heart. Well, the bullies that comprise the state are no different. We libertarians may have a role to play, but it won't be pushing the bullies out. They'll do that pretty much on their own. If that's not a white pill, I don't know what is. Okay, so now let's dive back in, where today I'll try to back up that wonderful white pill. I'll start by taking on the gut reaction response most anarchists and libertarians will likely have when I say that the state itself will back off, that I'm crazy, that I'm pie in the sky, that I'm not looking at reality. The state backing off? Right. So I'll start with this. I agree with them 100%. That is, if we're talking about the conditions today. Today, the environment is very hospitable for the state. It's basically welcomed with open arms. The myth of authority is the reason. Most people still believe in it, and that creates this attractive environment for state bullies. End result? Rock solid statism. The bullies of the state would never dream of backing off. I agree, but I'm not referring to today. I'm referring to further down the road of the transition, to a point where the myth of authority is eroded more than it is today, enough to alter the environment in which the bullies exist. And this leads to a point I need to strongly emphasize, a critical aspect of this analysis, thinking about the environment in which the bullies exist. I'll always be coming back to it, and I'd like you to make a mental bookmark as well. I want you to watch the thread running through this analysis, namely, the effect of the surrounding environment and how the bullies have to deal with that environment. Here's what I mean. The human psychology of this is very straightforward. When any of us are faced with choices, our minds perform calculations, usually subconsciously. We weigh the good and the bad, the comfortable and the not so comfortable, the short and long term, the costs and rewards. All these expectations and trade-offs are part of decision-making. The bullies of the state do this too. They're no different. They do it in their private lives, they do it in their careers, they do it all the time, just like the rest of us. This is a normal human process. And whenever we do it, it's in the context of the options and conditions at hand. It's based on the environment in which we find ourselves. It's this simple, universal human experience that I'm talking about when I say that the bullies are always weighing their options at any point in time. Up to now, when their minds weighed their political options, it was within an environment that was super bully-friendly. So no shock, they would enter and stay in politics. They took full advantage of it. That's statism. That's the state as we know it. Very powerful, precisely because for the bullies, the myth is powerful, attractive, enticing, desirable. But today, the myth has started to erode. It's still in its baby steps, but the trend is underway, as I'll demonstrate later. Well, in turn, the environment is changing. So As this trend continues, it will change to be tangibly less welcoming to the state bullies, both the existing ones and the potential bullies. They will sense that environment just as they sense the super welcoming environment of the past. And this will produce different actions by the bullies compared to their responses up to now, because their considerations will be influenced by how that slightly less welcoming environment feels. Bottom line, gradually they will disfavor a political career. They will gravitate toward choices outside of politics, choices that feel more hospitable to them. That's what I mean when I say they will back off. Politics will start to become too much trouble for the effort. I'll illustrate the idea with an analogy. Picture a monstrously large sheet of glass. It sits above all the people. Everyone has their hands up over their heads. They're all holding it up. The sheet is the myth of authority. All of us holding up the sheet of glass aren't even aware we're doing it, any more than people today are aware they hold the myth in their minds. The state gets to skate along the top of the glass, supported by the people, by the myth. But again, let's be clear who exactly are up there. It's not the entirety of all the people who comprise the state. It's only those 3 million state bullies, armed law enforcement and military, and politicians. Again, I'm using United States numbers here. Yes, of course, the state employs many, many tens of millions more people. But remember, I've referred to them as the state clerks. They do not wield the power of a gun. They are down below, holding up the sheet of glass like the rest of us. That helps emphasize that the sheet of glass does not represent financial support. It's moral support. It's the myth holding up the bullies. And the state clerks are in our group in that sense. They believe the myth too, so they are holding up the glass sheet as well. So you've got 3 million bullies skating along the top. And by the way, it doesn't matter that some of the bullies know they're parasites while others are just as blind. Either way, they're up there. They exist in that environment, a solid, hard sheet of glass. And that's the key to how we'll explore the analogy. The sheet of glass as the environment holding up the bullies, making them feel powerful, secure, and welcome. Now, whenever one person down there in the crowd removes himself from supporting the glass, a tiny chip appears, like those minor, harmless windshield imperfections. Not only harmless, but barely visible. That represents a red-pilled person, a person who is over the myth of authority. Now, let's use this analogy and examine the sheet of glass before the transition when the myth of authority was solid. The glass has no chips at all, or none to speak of, because everyone believes the myth. Solid glass, so an obviously secure and welcoming environment for our bullies. Fast forward to today. That sheet of glass doesn't look exactly the same anymore, because today, every one of you, assuming you are past the myth of authority, has lowered your arms. You are not holding up that sheet of glass. All of us who are past the myth caused our own little tiny chip in the glass, as many chips as there are people over the myth. Granted, that's not a lot in the bigger scheme of things. That's why it's fair to say those chips are barely visible. The bullies skating up there look down and still see solid glass, or anyway, not enough chips to matter to them, because there just aren't enough chips to be noticeable, not enough to affect the feel of the environment for the bullies. Now, every once in a while, we red pill someone else. They become another little chip. But darn it, even taken together, all the chips are still not really noticeable. Not now, anyway. Incidentally, you may wonder where libertarian voters fit into this. Well, that's answered individually. We'd have to ask, in their efforts, are they helping people get past the myth of authority? For that matter, are they personally past it? Or are they still under the myth's spell? If so, and what's probably more likely, is that they are not quite past the myth, so no, they are still holding up the sheet of glass. And sadly, those they influence are still holding it up. These libertarians are just reaffirming the myth. But I can't say that for sure. I hope I'm wrong. Now let's think about those bullies skating up there and how some of us down below don't like them at all and want them to go away. Let's look at different ways we might deal with that. Start with the actual case of some of the old-style anarchists of the late 19th, early 20th century. They had a gut instinct that statism was illegitimate, but they did not recognize the myth of authority as the root cause. So they set their sights on the effect, the symptom, the state itself. They looked up above the glass and saw the state bullies personally as the problem. They didn't see that the root of the problem was the people holding up the glass. Some of these early anarchists wanted to take down the state violently. I mean, real violence. They attacked politicians directly. They targeted the bullies above the sheet of glass directly. And what happened? Well, since the majority believed the myth, they saw those actions as morally wrong, as attacking their moral leaders. They denounced the anarchists. And of course, the myth ensures that anyone taken out that way is replaced by another ruler. The lesson there is, once again, they did not strike the root. All they did was keep the problem going, maintaining a ripe environment for the state bullies. Now, it's true, they tried to make that environment uncomfortable for the bullies, but it was an environment they tried to create artificially. It wasn't organic. Their failure only helps illustrate why the transition will be healthiest if it's bottom-up, unplanned, and organic. And it shows why we should not advocate violence in the transition. It won't help us personally, and it certainly won't move things in the right direction. It would only help affirm the myth, keeping that sheet of glass solid and welcoming to the bullies. Okay, that was one way people might deal with the bullies up there. Now let's look at two more ways we can imagine it playing out. I don't think either of these is likely, so we'll run through them quickly. Then we can get back to what's most likely to happen. As I've said, the progress of the transition will be measured by the progress of the erosion of the myth. Here at the early stages, the myth is only starting to be questioned. So now let's imagine that it makes no further progress. Basically, it stops dead in its tracks. Whatever spreading of our ideas has happened is all that will ever happen. The number of red-pilled people stops growing. Thus, the number of small chips in the sheet of glass stops increasing. They were pretty much invisible before, and now it stays that way. The environment of the myth stays about how it is now, still very conducive to the bullies, still attractive enough to draw them to power. So yes, if the myth eroded no further than it has up to now, statism would persist. Now, I see a big problem with that. As I'll show later, there's plenty of evidence. There's a trend that the myth is indeed eroding. And with each passing year, we get more and more examples. So for the myth to stop dead at this point would mean the trend stops too. Possible, I suppose, but there's no evidence it will stop. Also, as I'll show later, the psychology of the transition will itself make it unlikely the trend will stop. That's because once people see truths by way of example out there in the world, it sort of gives their mind permission to ponder new thoughts. Well, that's real kryptonite to the myth of authority. Okay, then there's the other possibility to consider, that the myth reverses course and regains its previous solid status. We go back to the previous times when pretty much everyone bought into the myth. I can't really imagine how that would play out. The red-pilled would have to become statist again, believing the myth again. The chips in the sheet of glass would have to disappear. It should be obvious that this is really unlikely. Once people wake up to any truth, it's almost impossible to force them back into blindness. When cult members wake up and leave a cult, well, if they truly woke up, they are really unlikely to go join another cult. When an abused spouse finally wakes up and leaves the abuser, she tends to be pretty well armed against future abuse. And you don't really ever see a young kid who gets over the belief in Santa Claus going back to believing. So no, I can't see how it's plausible the myth stops eroding, let alone ever goes back to full population-wide indoctrination. So now, let's examine what seems to actually be happening. An admittedly slow but steady decline in the myth of authority. Our sheet of glass is getting a few more chips in it every day. The important people we want red-pilled are the influencers, because they create even more chips in the glass, not just their own. They and everyone they influence put their arms down. They're not holding up the myth anymore. But there's also another source of chips in the glass. A person doesn't necessarily have to be red-pilled by a libertarian influence. Many just withdraw support on their own. They somehow come to realize that they are holding up the sheet, supporting parasites. They get tired of it, even if they don't explicitly know they're getting over the myth of authority. That's still good, because their mind has made progress toward that end. I'll include some examples of that later as well. Now, it's great there's an increase in the number of people who stop holding up the glass and the number of chips in the glass. But remember, those chips are really widely dispersed. They are not clustered together. That's why it's not particularly noticeable from up above to the bullies. Right now, anyway, the look and feel of their environment hasn't noticeably changed, at least not by much. But we have more to say about this environment. So far, we've only defined the environment by the myth of authority, since that's the root of the state, and indeed, the myth is the key component of that environment. But we can't overlook some other factors for the bullies in the environment, factors other than how welcome they feel due to the myth. There's actually two important ones. One is the price they must pay to play politics and rule over others. Another is the alternative opportunities they have outside of politics. Let's talk about the cost the bullies must pay if they want to be rulers. Dominating others doesn't come for free. Remember, they have to be active, not passive, as bullies. They have to keep the propaganda going relentlessly to keep the myth going. To illustrate just how much effort it takes to keep up the ruse, think back again to the story of the Wizard of Oz. He was one guy governing the whole city, numerically outnumbered, just like in our world, but in an environment where he's worshipped and therefore fully supported. You'll remember all the distractions the wizard had to use to keep the fake going. The threats from the outside, projections, smoke, mirrors, sound effects, noise, keeping people in a fog. Anything to draw their attention away from the reality that he's just one average guy. You saw it in his speeches, always using vague terms and getting crowds worked up emotionally. That's how our own bullies do it. Look here, a distraction. Fear this enemy. Fear this disease. Fear the weather. Fear each other. Talk gibberish, because when you don't want someone to think, gibberish fogs their minds. Think of all the exhausting effort the wizard had to put in to keep up the farce. The state, too, has to do all that work. That work, that effort, is part of their environment if they choose to be in politics. It just comes with the territory, with the environment. If they want to play politics, that non-stop work is the price to pay. Another factor is this: the other choices available to them in the non-political world, the options offered down below the sheet of glass in the normal world. These include job opportunities, business opportunities, social pursuits, even leisure, hobby, travel, sports, and so on. None of this is new, but with advancing technology, there are more and more choices out there, more easily accessible, and at least for most people, more interesting choices. So let's remember that these are part of the real-world environment, just as the myth of authority is part of it. That myth draws the attention of the bullies, but they do have other factors to calculate: the constant effort of keeping up the sideshow, as well as other things they can be doing in life. They are the attractions and trade-offs competing for the bully's time and attention. At any given moment, The bullies are always in a position of weighing their options based on how attractive things are. Okay, now let's talk about those chips in the glass. So far, I've acknowledged 100% that they are barely visible, very dispersed. Most importantly, the bullies themselves don't even see them. But in just the recent decade, a very few of those chips are a little larger. Or perhaps another way of putting it is that the chips have increased in number here and there to where we can say it's just starting to be noticeable. This could be from influencers having broader exposure. It can be specific events starting to wake people up. Whatever it is, it's starting to be noticeable. We can see a genuine trend. 20 years ago, we absolutely did not see the type of signs we see today in the erosion of the myth. But during these last decades, especially now with the internet, we can find examples. This is a trend. So where are we headed? We're headed to more chips, to the point where, here and there, maybe they don't just look like scattered chips. There's larger, a bit more visible cracks, like those star-shaped windshield cracks. No, not big ones, but a few will start to be visible. Maybe some of the bullies skating along on top will start to see them. The way an individual bully might possibly sense it is like the feeling of standing right over a crack, a feeling of worry that things are a bit shakier now. That's when they're personally worried. Back in the real world, this might play out as a politician giving a speech, and he gets yelled down by the crowd. He didn't feel the environment as quite so welcoming that day, did he? Or it could be a cop who stops a driver. Sure, the driver cooperates, but he gives the cop a super cold shoulder. He's not belligerent, but not friendly either. The cop and even his fellow cops start to notice that more people are like that than ever before. Their environment has changed, not as welcoming. And the environment will not strictly be the displeasure people feel toward the bullies. It can be inhospitable in other ways. If a government agency is having to cut back, there won't be enough money to fund the goodies they're used to getting. That's the environment changing for the worse. Or the regulators might notice that more people are just ignoring the rules, building codes, business compliance, environmental regulations, whatever. That aspect of the environment becomes more difficult to deal with. In 1,000 ways, the bullies might sense that they are standing over cracks in the glass. They don't feel quite as comfortable in their jobs as before. What's experienced by the bullies is just the sense that things aren't perfect. To them, it's not seeing that a particular person is behind it. The bullies will simply sense an environment that just isn't as welcoming, a sense that the public doesn't fully regard them as legitimate like before, a growing disrespect, etc. And even here, the bullies know there have always been people who mock and belittle them. That's not new. But what is in the wind is this sense that it's growing. It's getting less favorable. Well, folks, we are seeing that. Above the glass sheet, the first sense is emerging to the bullies that those chips are spreading out cracks. No, the cracks aren't long yet. What's really more noticeable is the number. We see more than just a few. It takes no imagination to realize it's like this everywhere. To realize the trend is heading to where the glass looks like it may eventually lose strength. So, back to the simple psychology I mentioned before. In each environment along the way, and in particular as it grows less welcoming, the bullies are doing the same unconscious calculations we all do when we make life decisions. Are we going to pursue particular goals or not? It depends on how attractive those goals are, what the cost is to get them, and what other competing options are also out there. The bullies' brains calculate the same things. Is the environment of ruling over others a welcoming one? If it's not as welcoming, is all that effort to keep up the distractions worth it? What other things can they do with their life in comparison? These are not theoretical speculations. These are exactly and precisely the trade-offs the bullies are starting to face. True, not overly dramatic at this stage, but in years to come, those other factors will carry greater weight in their calculations. And later still, the trend leads to where things are quite unfavorable. The bullies in turn respond to that environment. If they're young bullies, they're not incentivized to even enter the environment, not even pursue politics or law enforcement or the military. They never take a position above the sheet of glass. Or if they are already a state bully, they're incentivized to leave the environment. They retire or switch to become state clerks or switch to the private sphere. In our analogy, they climb down off the sheet of glass. Either way, they are likely to find other, more comfortable things to do in life. Politics will start to feel too much trouble for the effort. The lesson is simple. As the environment changes, the outward behavior of the bullies change. They back off. Now, so far, I've just described the psychology of the transition, but nothing hits home like real-world examples, and I'll have plenty of those in an upcoming episode. As a taste, though, think of COVID. Early on, the initial environment of panic and hysteria caused people to be compliant. That environment encouraged the bullies to push for more and more controls. But later, there was a point where mass compliance started to erode. The environment changed for the bullies, and we saw the bullies back off. Now, unless I missed something, I believe COVID was not cured. It's still around. New strains all the time, and a vaccine that doesn't stop it. So, I'm curious, if all those rules and regulations and mandates and vaccine passports and vaccine job requirements, etc., were so effective and so necessary, why are they not still with us? It's because the non-compliant environment is too unattractive to the bullies. That principle can be used as a template for studying the bullies' behavior in any situation, meaning any environment. They will go only so far as is comfortable for them. Next time, we'll look at actual examples, real-world examples that demonstrate the shifting environment of the myth of authority. I want to help solidify in your minds the awesome white pill here, that the bullies are going to be the ones backing off as the transition plays out. We don't have to attack them violently. We don't have to persuade them that statism is wrong. We don't have to ask them to read books or listen to podcasts. We only have to let them deal with the environment presented to them. Now, if we can help shape that environment into one that's less welcoming, we should go for it. But once they start sensing those cracks forming in the glass, they only have to do what they do best, pursue their own selfish interests. As the cracks keep forming, that self-interest will get them off their asses to find safer pastures. So, with more to come in this series, we'll wrap things up for today. Take care, and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.